Over the years, Portal 2 has had a huge amount of custom content made by the community. The workshop is currently sitting at over 800,000 maps made by the community, with a smaller amount, about 15,000, made in the Hammer editor, the software used to make custom levels like this. Many mappers, including myself, have used the workshop to create a linked series of maps following one singular story, like a mini custom campaign. In this video, I'll be reviewing the most popular map series of all time. But how am I measuring what is the most popular? The workshop has various ways you can measure it. If I look at top rated collections, well, let's just say reviewing that would be a bit awkward. So instead, I'm measuring it by what are the most played maps on the workshop, which goes to the map series 12 Angry Tests by Carrot, with about 500,000 plays. This map series was released to the workshop as soon as the workshop was made active, which is because it was already made by that time. It was first uploaded to the Thinking with Portals website, which used to be the main way people would share their custom maps. Anyway, I found the old 12 Angry Tests submission from there, and the first map seems to have been released on the 16th of October 2011. And from my research, it seems the maps were actually made out of order, so the second map was the first one that got made, and the first map was made later on in development. Anyway, Carrot makes it very clear in his description that he wants to know everything that can be improved. Now, I'm a little late to the party, but I'm sure you can tell by the length of this video I have a thing or two to say about this map series. But before I get into this, I want to address a few points. Obviously, we must understand this was made very early in the Portal 2 community's life, so obviously we shouldn't be expecting the same level of quality as mappers who have had years to refine their skills. But at the same time, that's no reason to not highlight the flaws. This has taken the title of the most popular map series of all time, and that's not going to change. So personally, I'd argue it sitting at the very top makes it even more deserving of scrutiny and analysis. So I'll be reviewing it the exact same way I would review any map made today. This video aims to analyse the techniques used in making this, teach new mappers what to do and what not to do, and answer the question, does 12 Angry Tests hold up after 14 years? But before we begin, I want to give a special thanks to James Elliott for sponsoring the channel. If you want to support me making videos like this, you can become a YouTube member today. Not only do you help me out, but you get early access to videos like this one, a shout out in my videos, and you get access to all my map files from all my tutorials for any mappers who are interested in that. But with that said, let's begin with the first map. The map starts off with us in a bedroom. If we look out the windows, we can see that we're on a warm island in the ocean. But when we step outside, we find ourselves in a dirty test chamber. And if we look at the windows from the outside, we can see that we were fooled by just a couple low quality pictures of a beach, which I feel is quite funny and it feels very on brand for Portal style humour. It potentially draws inspiration from some of the beta footage from Portal 2, where we can also see a fake beach setting. Also, the design of the room forces you to walk past these windows, making sure you don't miss the joke, which I feel is good level design. The lighting in the room is fairly strong, although it could use some adjustments with light maps, as some of the shadows do look a bit odd in certain areas. There is a decent amount of decoration present, although it's fairly simplistic. We don't see much plants and the area above the ceiling feels quite cuboid, and overall the destruction present does feel very rectangle based. In my opinion, the area above the ceiling could use more to obstruct the pure white texture. They do a better job of this later on the map with square beams and plants, so it would have been nice to see more of that here too. It's a bit of a nitpick, but they feature an observation room here, and usually in overgrown areas these rooms are turned off. And also it doesn't feature any furniture inside. I'd say the room works well to convey what it needs to. The wake up area and the twist of the beach just being pictures is really funny and done well, making good use of the world portal entities too, which if you don't know what a world portal is, it basically lets you connect two different areas in a map with a secret portal. The room could do with more detail, particularly with plant work for example. Now there is one interesting issue with this room that I do have, and it's that this entire ceiling here was ripped from Portal 2, specifically this overgrown map. For me, it's a bit of a shame to see something like this just copied and pasted in. Personally, I believe it's always better to do decoration yourself, but given it's only this one fairly small thing, we'll just take note of this and move on for now. If we move through this door, we enter into this corridor. A machine falls from above and crashes, damaging this wall. I think it's a creative way of using this animation of this wall breaking, as it normally isn't intended for that, but it fits here perfectly and adds a lot to the destroyed atmosphere of the map. Whilst at face value, the environment here seems pretty strong, similar to the last section, there is some decoration which seems to be ripped from the main game. This wall is almost identical to this collapsed ceiling from Portal 2. There are also a few instances of floating bits of decoration. I'm not entirely sure how this happened, but if I were to guess, I'd say decoration was likely copied from Valve maps and inserted into this map without proper consideration. On the lighting, it's generally decent, although some sections have these awkward blocky shadows, which could be fixed by using different light map settings. And this door doesn't make use of a block light brush, resulting in the light from the other room coming through even when the door is closed. Moving on to the next room, we're introduced to this defective turret character with this short sequence here. I think it's pretty well done, and it's a funny introduction to this character. According to the description of the map, what happened here was he got fired because he failed to protect this portal gun, and now he's vowed revenge on the player. Looking at the actual room, overall it's decent, but there are a few problems, like this water reflection hasn't been set up correctly, as you can't see any props being reflected in the water. This is a simple fix, just enable fast reflections on the prop and it will reflect. We also see a few plants clearly clipping through the ceiling, and when you move around at certain spots you're able to see the water flickering. This is because they've used two different water brushes at different levels, which can cause issues like this. Now to progress from here, this gap forces the player to use both portals. I'll actually compliment this. Not only does it serve its main purpose to make sure the player picks up the portal gun, but it forces the player to acknowledge the dual portal device. As sometimes players assume in custom maps that when they first pick up a portal gun it will be a single portal gun. I've had this issue before when developing Frostbite, a mod I'm working on. I initially had players immediately get the dual portal gun, and the playtesters would end up not noticing for a few minutes as they tried to solving the puzzle with control of only one portal. Then we get an elevator sequence and finish the map. Overall, it's a nice short map which is carried mostly by the creativity of the various sequences. The gameplay is pretty basic. You open a door, walk around, pick up a portal gun and shoot across one gap. So there is definitely an argument to be made that its simplicity helped with its success. Often easy maps are more likely to get popular just because they're easy. Personally, I'm of the belief that maps like that aren't often always deserving of their popularity compared to the more complex and thought out maps that require actual time and thought to beat. But it's the way the system works. The visuals and hammerwork of the map are alright. It's about what you'd expect from a somewhat experienced beginner nowadays, although they have made clever use of world portals and they've ported in some other assets to get the beach sequence to work. I will say for the introduction map to the most popular map series, it's perhaps underwhelming, although for its time I could understand why it felt like a standout example. Now onto part 2. This starts off in an elevator and we progress into a clean-ish test chamber. As we enter, we get a little animation with these panels pushing out, which is a nice touch. The room itself is pretty simple. There is some decoration like this area above the ceiling and the white tiles on the edge of the floor, which is unusual but can work as a stylistic choice. There are some issues. The texture used for the floor is a wall texture. The buttons aren't on their stand like they should be, they're just flat on the floor. Although while most of these are pretty nitpicky, something I would really draw attention to is the lighting. It's white lighting and it's about all equally bright everywhere. We don't really see any shadows. It would have been nice to see more variation and an actual colour theme for the lighting, as well as usage of other light entities in order to create shadows, like the area above the ceiling would have been a great spot to put a projector texture, which could have produced some nice shadows from the metal truss, the wires and the square beams in the ceiling. There is also some odd antline usage going on. This is fairly nitpicky, but for the buttons they stop at the corner when usually they meet it at the centre. And with the laser catcher they aren't aligned correctly. They're supposed to be aligned with the sides of these panels, not go through the middle on the seams of the tiles. Again, it's nitpicky, but it's the antline conventions which were set by Valve. And one more flaw, if you look in the ceiling we can see a no-draw texture. The puzzle itself is fairly simple, just getting some cubes and stacking them for this laser puzzle. Continuing, we enter this hallway. I feel like there are some improvements in this area, mainly these lights have colour and actually contribute to shadows, which is nice to see. Although here this is a fairly odd looking light that I've never seen before. If we try progressing forward, the door sparks, indicating that it's broken, so we have to find another way forward, which is through this broken glass into the observation room. We can shoot a portal, then head over to these arm panel stairs, which themselves are a nice little feature. I know setting up these panels can take a while, and we've got sparks coming out from one of these, indicating this one is broken. We can use this to portal into the observation room, which is a bit familiar, but I'll get back to that in a second. Because more notably, when we step outside the observation room, we have this section, which is even more familiar, because this entire hallway was ripped from Portal 2, specifically the first map of Chapter 8, and if we follow the hallway to the end, we end up in this office room. The office itself looks quite nice. They've done a great job at imitating Valve's approach. I imagine you already know what I'm about to say, but that's because this room is directly copied from Portal 2 also. The same map as that hallway. In fact, the mapper loved this room so much, he copied it twice, but cutting furniture from one of them for some reason. Now, I was willing to let the stuff in the last map slide, as you do often get people using prefabs for smaller sections of a map. While I myself disagree with that approach to mapping, I can still tolerate it when done sparingly and when the prefabs are consistent with the rest of the map's quality. But when you're ripping entire rooms and areas from the game, that's too much in my opinion. And I don't believe this being early days mapping is a good enough excuse. We still get beginners today making new maps, and I almost never see beginners rip sections from Valve like this. They may not be producing the highest quality maps, but at least they're original. I imagine this will spark disagreement, but I firmly hold the view that it's always better to build your own environments inspired from Portal 2. It shows a lot more care and creativity and gives you a chance to learn how to make things that look as good as Valve. But if you just copy and paste, you won't learn this, and I do believe that's something that's present in the map. In sections where the mapper is forced to make something original, it just isn't the same quality because of these shortcuts taken. But continuing with the map, we have to portal over to this observation room, then shoot a portal through a vent and get inside this next test chamber, which has similar notes to the first test chamber, and again a fairly simple puzzle where you have to bring a cube through a few layers of fizzlers until you reach the end. Now when we step inside the elevator, we get this sequence. It's a simple effect, but I think it works pretty well. It's unexpected, and it also ties that defective turret back into the story. It builds intrigue, and it sets up the next map. Overall, it's a fairly simple little map. We have some test chambers with some puzzles focused quite a lot on fizzler toggling. The strengths of this map would be that it offers a lot more gameplay than the first map. Even the behind the scenes exploration section has you portaling around the place to reach the next location. And the puzzles have a lot more going on than in the last map, although I would argue that they feel a little repetitive by the end. The main strength would probably be the sense of exploration and story from this map, featuring a segment where you go off track. The main drawbacks are that the visuals are quite simple, often featuring very basic lighting, and some areas seem to have been set up a bit more carelessly, resulting in the visible nodal texture, and of course we have the section that features multiple locations ripped from the main game, which was pretty disappointing for me to see. But let's move on to the next map. This map starts with the sounds of falling and crashing. We fade in and we've broken into a test sphere. The elevator crashes and we're knocked out. When we wake up, the bird flies away with the portal gun. The effects are pretty simple, but the result is still pretty good. It's a short but fun little sequence. It follows on from the last map well, and it works to set up this one, giving us the immediate goal with getting the portal gun back. It shares similarities to the fall sequence from Portal 2, especially with the falling from an elevator shaft and the bird being present as we wake up, but it's very different in both execution and setting. And here, instead of the bird carrying away potatoes, it takes away our entire portal gun, which is quite funny. From here the way forward is clear. We need to follow these collapsed structures that form a path to the portal gun. Onto the visuals, I will start this by saying elevators aside, I couldn't pinpoint anything else being taken from the main game, so it's nice to see a bit more originality in the environment design, although it is fairly simple. There is a very strong cuboid feel with it all, and it could use with a bit more lighting work. These cuboid brushes as supports feel a little odd to me. In the main game, the supports for the underground test chambers are either concrete pillars like we have on this side, and or some various models. This kind of texture is generally only used for the test chamber walls, but moving on. With the help of some dripping blue gel, we can bounce up here and fetch the portal gun from this nest. Shame the crow is nowhere in sight though, but it's still a good way to establish the theme of gels to the player, plus the way it's designed forces the player to return back once they've got a portal gun. And I always like to see level design that makes good reuse out of an area. I will say that looking at this area, I'm not sure what this destroyed area used to be. It doesn't seem to have anywhere in this map to connect to. Whilst that catwalk near the elevator is destroyed, it seems like it's clearly supposed to connect to that catwalk right next to it. And even then, it seems too far away from this area. It seems like this was designed with with just the simple idea of a destroyed test chamber, which, whilst it can be a good premise for an exploration section in a testing sphere, I feel it wasn't properly considered in the environment design of the map. It would have been nice to see other catwalks in this direction, or if a chunk of the main test chamber we do use seems to be destroyed, and we could infer that this part collapsed from the main test. But as it is, when you look around, it just doesn't feel like this fits right. But from here we have to shoot a portal over to the main test, which is thankfully well lit. Now we enter the first puzzle, which involves using speed gel to build momentum and fling yourself about. It's pretty simple, but it does serve to set up the idea of speed gel, much like how the leaking pipe sets up blue gel. As for the visuals of this area, whilst I will compliment the lighting, especially the nice shadows, such as these shadows from these frame models being cast onto the floor and the wall by the speed gel. Now onto other aspects of this area. Whilst things like textures used are the correct textures for an old aperture aesthetic, it seems they simplified it quite a lot and turned their decoration into something very grid based and very flat. I've been practicing this aesthetic lately, and I will say it's probably one of the hardest aesthetics to master, but that's mainly because of how much the aesthetic thrives off asymmetry and unusual shapes, blending both metalwork and woodwork, making something that feels both grand and shoddy at the same time. The walls are usually quite complicated. The back layer will be split into different layers of these metal panels alongside these metal trusses and wooden planks for support. Some of the panels on the walls might poke out slightly, creating shadows on the panels flat with the wall, and often we'll see props like ducts or frames on these walls. And when we see gaps in the walls, we will see usage of grates alongside the frames, and we'll see wooden boards being used to cover up gaps. I could go on, but I'll be making another video entirely on this aesthetic in the future. The point is, the version we see here is very simplified. It feels like it's trying to apply the approach for a destroyed modern aperture test chamber by giving this a large cuboid look and doing very grid-based destruction. Next, we move into this section, which is quite big, but only a little of it is used. We also see two things here which don't really appear in this aesthetic. On this wall, you can see this square beam model. Often you see beginner mappers include this in old aperture aesthetics. Now technically, it can fit, although personally I avoid it, because as far as I know, the main game Portal 2 never uses this model in old aperture test chambers besides for the floodlights. And similarly over here, this wall light model, whilst almost every old aperture map has this model, they mostly appear on the exterior of the test chambers, not the inside. That isn't without exception, although it is a very common pattern. The main light source for old aperture maps is supposed to be this light model strip for most wall lights, and this hanging light for ceiling light, which I don't see any usage of. The ceiling light and the strip light does sometimes appear, but it's often seen as orange variant when usually that's the rarer variant. Now I am getting nitpicky here, so let's move on. Next we need to press this button to get some gel, and the outlines for this are massive for some reason, but anyway. Next we have to use some portals to get up here, then we have to use the speed gel to avoid these pistons and fling ourselves to the exit. It's a fairly simple puzzle, but it is still quite fun in its execution, especially when all these pistons are synced with the player moving as we pass right through them. Narrowly avoiding them, even though given the way the map is designed we would never hit them, but it still feels satisfying. Overall, this map feels much more like a step in the right direction compared to the last map. Ignoring elevators, this map uses original environments, which, whilst perhaps simplified, do still convey that old aperture aesthetic with nice examples of lighting in some areas. The puzzles are simple, but being momentum and gel based, they are still quite fun, and I like the progression from just blue gel, just orange gel, to then having both and throw dodging pistons into the mix. Honestly, it's actually good progression. The story and the cutscenes for this remain a highlight, with the crashing sequence at the start and the funny bit where the bird steals your portal gun, but now let's move on to the fourth map. The map starts off in an elevator where we have an old aperture elevator arrive in a modern aperture elevator room, which is definitely an interesting sight, but moving on. We enter this hallway where we see a little sequence where panels are lifted to form stairs as we walk up them, which is a nice little touch, although for some reason two of the arm panels are yellow. No idea why, but anyway, we enter into another overgrown test chamber. Whilst the decoration inside the test chamber is fairly simple, I think there are some nice examples of lighting, particularly with all these shadows being created from the skylight. There's also a lot of texture variation, which is nice to see. For the bottom half of this test chamber, they consistently use this other variant of the dirty tiles, one which I think could be described as even dirtier. It's not entirely clear what called for this, but I interpreted it as being water damage, like at some point the water present was as high as the top of that tile, and the tiles became weathered by the water. but for some reason the water got drained away. Technically, I can't confirm whether this is clever world building or just random texture choice, but given how consistent it is, I'd say it very likely is the intention. Now from here we can make a portal over to that light bridge. If we go through the portal, we can see a little sequence where this panel falls off the wall and splashes into the water. I think that's a nice little effect that definitely adds to the atmosphere of this place feeling worn down, although one little problem about it is that it only triggers if you go here, but you actually don't have to go here at all. The puzzle can be solved by just moving a bridge along a wall, so maybe it would have benefited from another trigger somewhere else. Also, from this point we get a better look at the ceiling. I'll talk a bit more about the area above the chamber shortly, but now I want to focus on the reflection. Much like in the first map, the reflections haven't been set up right, so we don't see any of the models reflecting. And another thing is that the white sky reflects as pure black. Now technically this is not entirely the mapper's fault, it's Valve's. The mapper technically set up the sky correctly, where you use the skybox texture and choose sky white in map properties, although the problem is that the sky will reflect as black in the water. You can also see this in Intro 5 from Portal 2, but Valve were mostly able to get away with it as you very rarely see both water and sky in campaign maps. To get around this, many mappers use different textures, like this pure white texture that's intended for a bulb, and rather than relying on the light from the sky, we fake it with various lighting entities like light spots and a projector texture. But moving on, if we bridge around this room, we can reach this second section involving crushers. We have to quickly move around them before they come back down. The crushers themselves are a little odd. They use the arm panel with this piston model, which is a bit strange to do it like this because you're supposed to just use the piston models that exist specifically for the crushers. But anyway, after that we reach the end of the puzzle. However, the door is blocked, but we've got another way to go thanks to the ceiling being destroyed. So then we can head up into the ceiling. Now we can see this area up close. Personally, I do like the plant growth here. I like how all the plants are grouped together and seem to connect, and I also like how it aligns nicely with how the light is actually coming in from the sky. The rest of the room does feature some destroyed elements, although it's mostly quite bare. I also appreciate the clipping work that's been done over these models, as usually many of these models don't actually have collision. Now we can go over here where it seems the map wants us to go up this truss. Whichever one we go up will break and smash through the floor. I will say that because of some lights that go through the floor, if you're paying attention it does kind of spoil what's going to happen. The light is going through these brushes because to make them fall they have to be a specific brush entity which happens to not block light. But to work around this you could just use a block light brush overlapping the ceiling. Once inside it is a bit awkward navigating when you're surrounded by all these brushes. It might work better if they broke into nothing when hitting the ground, or maybe most of them break into nothing and some of them remained but didn't have a collision with the player. But looking around at our surroundings, we're in some concrete style hallway. It's a pretty empty room besides the pipes, and the lights here are weirdly bright. It's like looking into the sun. But now we can enter into the next test chamber, which is in a very similar style to the last one, so similar notes apply. We have a few notable details here. There are these unusual fizzlers that only have one emitter. This seems to have been done as they wanted a vertical fizzler without adding a spot in the water that a player could jump onto. It's definitely an odd situation to work out, but I personally disagree with their choice here. I think it would have worked better if they did add another emitter on the ground and just use clever clipping and potentially a trigger push to make sure the player slides off it if they did try to jump on it. Another unusual detail about this is the turret, which has a hat, which is quite funny and feels on theme with the vibe of these maps. The ceiling here is particularly interesting. Again, like other ceilings, much of it is copied, and a weird thing is we see a lot of wires and props that are entirely inside the wall. So it's disappointing to see something being copied carelessly where it results in so much clipping and unneeded entities. But regardless, I still think lots of what's happening with the ceiling is pretty interesting. It's got a unique shape and the view is broken up with plants and various props to block out the pure white sky. I can't be sure how much of this is copied. I think it's just the ceiling piece that's handled, and the area above the ceiling I think is original, or perhaps multiple locations merged. Either way, minus some slightly confusing brushwork, it works pretty well. One fun little detail is where the laser is pointing has been broken, which I think is good attention to detail. The puzzle itself is probably the most complex one so far, although I'd still call it easy enough for the average player. It involves 3 different cubes and a laser, although the laser is only used once to kill the turret. It would be nice if it was given more use besides that, but once we beat it we enter an elevator and reach the end of the map. Overall this one's pretty good. Not much happens for the story, but it does establish us being back in modern Aperture. The puzzles offer a lot more than the previous ones, and the map continues the theme of exploration with that section between the test chambers and has that surprise sequence where you collapse through the ceiling. Thankfully we see a lot more original work than copied, with a few areas I thought they did quite well. even though it could benefit from another level of polish. But let's look into the next map. This next map uses the Wheatley style from Portal 2, just without Wheatley. This first test here has a bunch going on, and unfortunately not much of it was by the mapper. One of the main features of Wheatley maps are these bottomless pits, and the one here has been ripped straight from the game. There is also this wall that's been pushed inwards, and this too was ripped from the game, which is all pretty disappointing for me to see after the last map seemed to have a lot more original decoration going on. And they've even added this wall in ROM, as you can see another panel behind these ones. The puzzle itself is pretty simple, working as an introduction puzzle to the funnel, although I like how the cube has some reuse with being both used to deactivate the fizzler and reverse the funnel. Unfortunately, that's about all I have to say on this. When the majority of the hammerwork isn't actually your own work, I'm not left with much to comment on. Moving on, we enter this hallway with a collapsed floor. I will say I do think the amount of rubble on this floor is disproportionate to the amount that should be here. A common occurrence in maps with destruction is actually not having enough debris and rubble beneath a destroyed ceiling or wall, but here we've got the opposite. There is so much here that I'm not really sure where it all came from. Besides that, the hallway is fairly empty besides a super bright light, and then we enter this large turret factory style area, which seems quite similar to that one section from Portal 2, because it is that section, just edited a bit. Now, if I'm being honest, I am getting really tired of this. What started as a surprise, noticing some corners were cut and adding those small office sections, has now become maps where most of what's here wasn't actually made by the mapper. Pointing this out is starting to get really repetitive. There'll be a segment at the end where I really get into this and why I dislike this approach to mapping, but I'm going to try to talk about it less until then. But continuing on with the map, we have to go up this funnel, but on our way up there we have a turret blocking our path, forcing us to get off the funnel and go around. I think it is a good use of the environment. Using it to maneuver around the turret adds something to the section more than just going up in a funnel. Also a unique use of a turret, using it essentially as a permanent wall rather than just the usual turret killing situation. Reaching the top, we have to get off and land on these panels. Then we have to get off those panels before they get cut in half, leading us onto this catwalk. This cutting setup is fairly basic. It uses a model that doesn't move and is placed at an awkward angle. There is a weird red particle constantly emitting from the cutter, which looks a bit odd, and it doesn't make any noises when it's cutting. All of these are things that could be fairly simple to add or rework, and it would greatly improve the setup here. Moving on, we return back to the test chambers. We have another chamber in a similar style as the last. There are some odd things going on, like these panels that are being pushed, but there is absolutely nothing behind them, and also this angled panel where the arm is clipping through the wall. And also there shouldn't even be a panel behind it, as the angled panel is supposed to be the same panel that would be a part of that wall. The puzzle is again fairly simple. Just follow the funnel till you get to the door, then push the cube around the room until it reaches the button. Then we reach the end of the map. Overall, this one follows the trend of the map series. We have two puzzles with some exploration mixed in the middle. We do also see probably the most copied environments so far. The puzzles themselves are still fairly simple, but we do get a lot more usage out of the elements present, which is nice. Personally, I prefer to see a simple puzzle that's efficient with its elements and sees lots of reuse than a harder one that isn't very efficient and uses more elements than necessary. But on to the next map. The sixth map continues the Wheatley style from the last map. We start in an elevator and end up in this test chamber, which again uses the same pit from the last one. But besides that, this map actually does offer some compelling original features we'll get into. The decoration in the room is fairly basic, but there's not really any damaged walls or any sort of decoration, and the shape of the room is pretty cuboid. The lighting is decent, everything is well lit without being too bright, and they've used a consistent cold colour theme for this area. I will say that as they're not using a bespoke pit for this map, you can see these odd spots that lack detailing, where you get completely blank walls and you're even able to see the gaps with absolutely nothing at all, just empty space, as normally this pit from the main game is meant to be seen from much higher up. Focusing on the puzzle, it's got a few parts and a bit more going on than in the usual puzzles so far. I'd still say it's quite simple though. We have to pull this orange gel by reversing the funnel, then drop the gel on the ramp and jump over the gap. Then we use the faith plate to fin ourselves into the funnel, which will get us across to the exit. It's a fairly linear, simple puzzle, but it's nice to see multiple uses of the funnel. But when we're crossing over, the funnel deactivates, the room breaks apart and half the room is moved and swapped for another chamber in this sequence here. Once the sequence is finished, a funnel activates and we can cross over to this new section. This sequence is definitely surprising, and it's a pretty unique way to add another puzzle to the map. The execution is actually fairly strong. We see the animation of these panels breaking apart, and despite dealing with moving brushes, the lighting and everything still works quite well. I do think there is a lot more that could be added, like shaking, sparks, lights flickering, but as it is, it's still pretty good. The next puzzle is still somewhat similar to the previous one, although this time involving some blue gel and a cube. We also technically reuse this faith plate, although it's a fairly unusual case of a reuse, but it still applies. So for what seemed like a random inclusion in the original puzzle, turned out to be a bit more clever than suspected. When we use the faith plate to return, we smash through this glass, which on the surface is a fun little sequence, but then the portable surfaces in this room become required to beat the puzzle. Normally when I see something breaking unintentionally like this being a requirement to beat the puzzle, I'd call it out as a continuity error, as the puzzle wouldn't be beatable in its correct state. Although given that this puzzle technically shouldn't exist as it's two halves of a puzzle smashed together, I think I can overlook that here, as neither of these puzzles were necessarily intended to be used together in continuity. But anyway, after beating the puzzle, we reach the elevator and finish the map, which is the last of the tests, but we still have one more map after this. But overall, this map probably offers the best custom sequence in the entire map series. We've seen time and time again custom sequences that make these maps feel alive are something that the mapper seems to love to add. The whole chamber ripping in half and a new one being inserted in felt straight out of the campaign. Which I mean as a compliment this time, as far as I can tell this isn't literally taken out of the game. The puzzles are also the most complex so far, although I'd still say they're on the easy side. They make reuse out of the elements, like the faith plate being used in both puzzles and the funnel being used for both the gels and the player in both puzzles. The environments are fairly simplistic, anything actually made by the mapper does lack any extra detailing. The lighting works well however, although unfortunately no standout examples of brilliant environments. But on to the seventh and final map. The final map starts us off in another elevator, however stepping outside of it we end up in a concrete hallway rather than a test chamber. I will point out how they made these walls wrong. That line you see near the top of the wall is intended to be at the very bottom of this type of wall, and the bits above it should use a different texture that doesn't have this. It's a little nitpicky, but it is still a flaw. Anyway, when we enter this hallway we start hearing the turret who's complaining about being unable to see. If we don't progress forward, these lines actually continue constantly, and it seems to be picking from a random selection of quite a few lines, so we actually rarely hear the same one in a row. And for anyone just playing normally and not stopping, they're not going to hear any repeated lines at all. I do think this works well for setting up this part of the map. We begin hearing the turret complaining about something before we actually see it. Reminds me of the start of chapter 8 where we hear Wheatley complaining about the cubes before we actually arrive there. I will say it might have worked better if there were slightly longer gaps between the complaints, which would better give the impression he's actually trying different methods and they keep failing, but in the time given it gives the impression he's just complaining at a loading screen or something that he can't control. Stepping through this door we enter this large area, and there is this monitor on a nearby wall. After a second it turns on and we can see the turret, which gives context to what he was talking about, trying to turn on this monitor. Then a large object falls from the ceiling and breaks a catwalk, and then the turret seems to accidentally break open a pipe which gives us conversion gel, then he leaves. Looking at the actual environment we're in, we can see it follows the trend of being very blocky and featuring fairly minimal detailing. That little block that the catwalk used to lead to has a door that keeps flickering for some reason. If I were to guess what happened, the mapper potentially placed that door texture down as an overlay, but that texture isn't designed for that. If you don't use hammer, that essentially means some textures are supposed to go on top of other textures, but if you place a texture not designed for that on top of another texture, you can get these sorts of errors. I will say that the placement of this main light works quite well. It provides visibility to the important features of the map, and it draws your eyes to the top part of the room where you're meant to be trying to reach. Back to the main focus being this conversion gel and this area below it, it shares very strong similarities to this map from Co-op, especially with the puzzle and lots of the textures used, and even the idea of it being above a cavern. I'm unsure whether anything was directly copied. It's possible this is just heavily inspired by, especially as it's missing a huge amount of detail present in the co-op version, although it is far too similar to be coincidental. The puzzle is mostly the same as in that co-op map, covering the floors and walls in gel so that we can portal onto this ramp, although here we've got this faith plate used in this puzzle. Once flinging ourselves up to the top of the map we can reach this faith plate, which appears to be supercharged by these cables. This is further conveyed with the electrical particles surrounding the cables, although The one weird thing about up here is that this catwalk is just floating, but moving on, the faceplate launches us very fast, and we hit into this concrete pillar. It feels a bit unsatisfying to go that fast and just stop abruptly with nothing happening. I feel like we should either be dead or at least have done some damage to that pillar, but whatever. We've now reached the final room where we confront the turret face to face, although this final room is once again taken from another map, specifically this map from Core 6 in the co-op. I mean, they've even left this signage on the wall to make it even easier to find which one they took it from. But focusing on the actual boss fight, a tube drops from the ceiling and bombs drop out of it, and land on the faceplate which launches the bombs towards the player. So another boss fight being focused on bombs being thrown at a player. What's next? We have to redirect the bombs to break a pipe. That gives us conversion gel. Well, we have to stand next to this pillar, which after being hit by a bomb will collapse and break a pipe on its way down, which will then give us conversion gel. So it's a very similar idea to the start of the Portal 2 boss fight with a different coat of paint. Well, technically it's the same paint, but that's not the point. Moving on, we can use the conversion gel to help us redirect the bomb to shoot it at the turret, which fractures the glass. Then he turns off the bombs and opens the floor for turret boxes to come out, which is a mistake from him as he meant to do normal turrets. So then he lowers more turrets from the ceiling, with the original turret box area acting as a barricade against these new turrets, which is a good use of turning a gag into an actual gameplay element. Next, we have to redirect the gel to those turrets to take them out. After doing so, the bombs reactivate and we have to redirect them at the turret to break the glass. Then he activates a laser wall which moves across the room, forcing us to use portals to survive. Then the bombs reactivate and we can shoot it at the turret, knocking him out of the room. Then he surrenders and this faceplate emerges from the floor. From here you can leave the turret or kill him. Although when you throw him in the water, his laser doesn't actually deactivate, so the water doesn't kill him for some reason. But that's the end of the boss fight. Overall it's decent, although fairly simple, and some elements are heavily borrowed from Portal 2's boss fight. I myself have made a boss fight for a map a few years ago in Portal Plus Chapter 5 Part 5, where I feature a reimagined boss fight with GLaDOS. Personally, I do think it has its flaws, my approach to level design has changed quite a bit since making those maps, but it actually features some similar ideas to this one. I also feature bombs that need to be redirected, and I actually also include a moving laser wall, which when I made it I didn't actually remember that it was included in this map, so it's a funny parallel that both of these maps have that. Here are a few factors that I think are important in designing a boss fight. One is featuring either underused or brand new mechanics designed for this boss fight, another is featuring a gameplay motif to the boss fight, another is changes in the environment to match the different stages of the fight, and finally they should include being able to exploit various boss attacks to use them against the boss. For that first point in Portal Plus, I used moving lasers, electrified water, and flamethrowers. 12 Angry Tests also uses moving lasers, although everything else it uses is pretty standard. Explosives are used in the boss fight for both Portal games, and turrets are anything but underused. Whilst conversion gel is present in the boss fight for Portal 2, it could be argued this is slightly more unique here, as the conversion gel is constantly present instead of just used at the start. But looking at gameplay motifs, Portal Plus features the laser moving. It's a move that GLaDOS uses multiple times between the unique moves, getting faster each time it's used. 12 Angry Tests arguably handles this better, with both the gel and the bombs being elements which return and are used multiple times throughout the boss fight, which does help give it an overall theme. For changes in the environment, Portal Plus features GLaDOS sparking when she's been struck with a bomb. Once the transfer buttons have been pressed, we can see the facility shaking, and throughout the fight we can see this bar on the screen progress, showing how close GLaDOS is to being shut down and swapped for Wheatley. In 12 Angry Tests this is actually handled pretty well, first with the pillar collapsing, then as the fight goes on the player themselves will naturally cover the arena in more and more gel. You can see the glass fracture then break as we throw bombs at it, and then when the turrets get added we have the addition of the barricade and the new turret platforms. And finally, for exploiting the boss's attacks, in Portal Plus we have redirecting the bombs, and we also have this segment where after the flamethrowers we need to stand on the flamethrowers to survive the electrified water. It's fairly simple, but still every move besides the moving laser plays into this idea. In 12 Angry Tests we have redirecting the bombs, and that's about it. The gel doesn't count as it isn't there intentionally, so overall, whilst there is lots of room for improvement, this boss fight does feature quite a lot of elements of a good boss fight, although it's mostly just lacking in the actual originality of the elements used. But after all this, we can get on the faceplate and we launch towards the exit. Then we can get on the elevator and we get one final sequence, which I have to mute as it plays presumably copyrighted music, but it ends with 12 angry turrets shooting at each other. Then the map ends, and that's the end of 12 Angry Tests. Overall, 12 Angry Tests is a brilliant example of the workshop in its infancy. It shows off a huge variation of environments and gameplay, and features many dynamic sequences throughout, but it does it in a much less refined way than what we'd see today. The environments are often simple and under-decorated, often incorporating cuboid geometry and unconventional techniques. Something I've heard a surprising amount of times is that the puzzles in this are tricky, which is absolutely not the case. They are objectively easy. I imagine I see this because 12 Angry Tests is very common for people's first map series on the workshop, and if that's all they've experienced then it's understandable they might think it's a bit tougher. So I'm likely biased in having over 1,000 hours in Portal 2 and having played much harder puzzles. So we'll say that many of these tests can still be fun and satisfying. They were all easy difficulty, just some had a bit more going on, which could feel harder if you're less experienced with workshop puzzles. And of course we need to highlight the copied areas, which I expect to be a bit of a divisive topic. Personally, I'm of the stance that what's been done in this series is too much. I feel it would have been much better had they just taken inspiration from these maps and created environments that felt inspired from Portal 2 as a whole, rather than just ripping entire environments from the game. In my opinion, it's worse than just laziness, because it's skipping the learning process. It is apparent through the environments that were solely made for this map series that their mapping skill doesn't match what they are taking from. It creates a strange contrast between these heavily designed Valve environments and these underdeveloped original areas. But had they taken the time to research the Valve maps and use it as inspiration for their own environments rather than directly copying it, we would have seen their skills evolve and they would have developed even better environments with each map. That was my approach with Portal Plus. I wasn't copying and pasting things from Portal 2, and if you follow along from what was made early on and what was made later on, you can see a very clear growth in my hammer skills, because I took the time to learn how to do everything and make it myself. So I not only feature detailed visuals, but I actually understand what makes it work. I'll leave it for now, so let's get back to the main question. Does 12 Angry Tests hold up? I might get in trouble for saying this, but my honest answer is no, it does not. Do not get me wrong, this map series is full of creative ideas and some very entertaining, sometimes surprising moments. The chamber ripping in half is great, the maps are actually pretty funny, and the puzzles are usually pretty fun even if simple. But its environments just don't hold up. Even the ones ripped from Portal 2 have been done so in a way that doesn't work as well, and the puzzles are very basic and limited compared to what else the workshop has to offer. The truth of it is that 12 Angry Tests is the most popular map series mainly because it was the first. Think about it, back when the workshop got released, what's more likely to draw your eyes? Some random poorly made disconnected maps, or a complete 7-part map series campaign? And that's what it was back in 2012. If you wanted to play a custom campaign, that was your main option. Well, Design for Danger was there later on, and that's next on my hit list if this video does well. And the reason for this is likely the player base since the launch of the workshop has died off a decent bit. So when the massive wave of players was here, they had very little choice but 12 Angry Tests. So it shot to number 1 and was able to hold that position due to its fun and easy gameplay and its charming sequences. I must clarify once again, I am not saying I hate this map series. I do like it, but I think it should be something we learn from, what works and what doesn't work in my opinion. Everyone will have different opinions about this, and this video serves as mine. But what about you? Do you think it holds up, or do you think it relied too heavily on being there first? What's a map series you would consider that deserves to be called the best of all time? And what would you like to see me review next? You can let me know down in the comments or over on my Discord, where we discuss mapping, host competitions, and you can get the latest on any new or upcoming videos. The link is in the description. But that's all from me. Thanks for watching.